In this video, I will argue that based on the evidence at Drayton Hall Plantation, digital or model restorations done while keeping a site preserved are much more beneficial than physically restoring the site itself. When we physically restore a site, we have to pick a time to restore it to, and it can be very easy to get caught up in the theatrics of a restoration. And then when this happens, we lose a lot of the nuances of what the site was in those different times. This is especially important when looking at a site that was continuously occupied for a long time. It also allows for continued research and archaeology while still generating income. When it comes to Drayton Hall Plantation, this method of preservation has shed light on the evolution of plantation life, as well as the ideals of those who lived in the American South. To give some background, Drayton Hall is a plantation-style home on the Ashley River in Charleston, South Carolina, and was adjacent to the Magnolia Plantation. When it was established originally as a tract of land in 1676, it was located in St. Andrew's Parish. The main house was built in 1738 by John Drayton in the Georgian Palladian style and stayed in the Drayton family for 7 generations. John Drayton was married 4 separate times, and 7 of his children survived infancy to grow up at Drayton Hall. The house and surrounding land was sold in 1974 to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, whose purpose is to enrich lives by saving our past, and is a private 501c3 nonprofit organization. John Drayton owned over 76,000 acres, comprised of 100 individual commercial plantations. While there is no exact record of the number of slaves owned by John Drayton, this number was likely in the thousands. John Drayton's second eldest son, Charles, wrote extensive journals which have been used to establish the daily life of both the main family as well as the slaves who lived on the property at Drayton Hall Plantation. On this massive amount of farmland, Drayton grew rice, cotton, and indigo, as well as lots of varieties of fruit over the years. After the Civil War, the area of the plantation that was on the banks of the Ashley River was mined for phosphate and continued to be so into the early 20th century to provide supplementary income for the plantation. The digital reconstruction of the house to its 18th century glory was done by the National Trust for Historic Preservation with the help of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities in the form of a 3D visualization fellowship. This digital restoration allows for the continued preservation of the site while also allowing visitors to experience and visualize how the house would have looked at its prime. By keeping the site in its state of 1974, when it was given to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, archaeologists are able to interpret the data without injuring the site. With the data compiled and established on a digital and preservation-based basis, these interpretations can be ongoing. One issue with archaeology that is seen in increasing instances today is that methods and understandings change, and in a lot of cases, we are unable to reinterpret a site after it has been excavated and restored by prior archaeologists. Rural Charleston, in general, has been preserved more than it has been restored due to the poverty in the Low Country into the 20th century. A lot of the artifacts which have been found at plantation sites from the antebellum South fall into a category known as colonialware. This term refers to the unglazed, low-fired earthenware believed to have been manufactured and used by both African Americans as well as historic period Native Americans. Based off of where these types of pottery are found, and in what frequency, it is an easy identifier of where people lived who were not of the upper-class British colonial aristocracy. It also shows where there was culture contact between the slave populations and the American Indians, and also, perhaps more indirectly, European colonists. The site at Drayton Hall, excavated in 2004, yielded 1,031 colonoware shards, as well as one complete vessel. The excavations done in 1978 found 12,000 shards of colonoware in the vicinity of the main house. It is also important to note that the entirety of the site was not excavated and that excavations were done on a stratified basis across the landscape. When archaeologists looked at the artifacts found during the 2004 excavation, they found that Drayton was a relatively good fit for the Carolina artifact pattern, developed by Stanley South, making the site applicable to broader inferences about plantations in the American South. His model groups the colonoware, as well as other artifacts, into 8 groups to be examined: the kitchen group, the architecture group, the arms group, the clothing group, the personal group, the furniture group, the tobacco group, and the activities group. Most of the ceramics found in excavations fall into the kitchen category. Investigations done in 2004, when compared to previous archaeological findings, show that the site in which is now the outer lawn area of Drayton Hall was the original site of the slave settlement, which was abandoned at some time around 1810. The artifacts found in this area are consistent with other excavated slave villages in the low country of South Carolina. It is important to note that in the 1990s, efforts to restore the landscape of the plantation were halted, with the preservation of the site in mind so that later digs could be conducted like the one in 2004. If the restoration of the site had been a goal, it is likely that a lot of the evidence of the slave settlement, as well as a majority of the colonowares, would have been disturbed and therefore lost to time when planting and performing the proper landscaping that would have been required for restoration. In 2005, after examining the details of the 2004 excavation, it was decided that a ground-penetrating radar study should be done to further look into the findings. This ground-penetrating radar study found several anomalies, identified later to be a large refuse pile, as well as another pile of broken brick. This rubble is in a linear formation, suggesting a building was once at the area. After the Civil War, a lot of the freedmen, along with their families, continued to work and live at the plantation. All of their homes and other related buildings have not yet been positively identified, and it is conjectured that this line of rubble is one of those buildings. In 2007, the privy on the site was excavated. The building itself is pretty well preserved, and the area around the privy that houses the drainage tracts was also well preserved by the topsoil. When looking at the drainage system, it was determined that the drainage system was very poorly and quickly built, with no obvious plan for the wastewater after it exited the leaching field. I can't help but think of the septic tank and system at my own home when looking at this data, and thinking about how delicate such systems can be and the havoc they wreak when the system clogs or overflows. In 1846, the privy was modified and made into an office and bedroom for a young man at the plantation. One thing that was strange about the findings of the privy is that usually when a privy is no longer in service, it is then used as a refuse building and is normally seen as a treasure trove of artifacts in the eyes of archaeologists. The majority of the work done at the privy during this time in 2007 was done in the interest of preserving the building and arresting its degradation. One part of the main home that is remarkable and shows many generations of use and modifications is the main fireplace in what is called the growth chart room. The main mantel is definitely from the original construction of the home. The picture knob is from a bit later, more mid-19th century. The mantel itself is not original to the house and is of a neoclassical design. If the site had been restored, a lot of these details and years of development would be lost. Since the site was preserved instead, all of these smaller nuances and years of change have been preserved and can continue to be studied. Drayton Hall is widely known to be the greatest example of Palladian architecture that we have in North America, still standing today. Palladian homes were, at the time, only for the richest of the rich, and were not only a show of European taste, but also wealth. The architecture of the home, including architectural cues outside of certain rooms, reinforced the ideas of a hierarchical society in which some people have more power over others. Some people were not allowed into certain rooms because of their status, and the architecture can help to inform a person of these roles. Overall, it is safe to say that the archaeological record, the layers of soil and artifacts, is part of the total historic fabric worthy of preservation. Our ability to use technology to restore sites while preserving the physical buildings and landscape is remarkable. We are able to get the best of both worlds. Visitors and curious scholars can view the digital reconstructions and see what the buildings and land would have looked like in its original construction without permanently changing the standing architecture. Drayton Hall has been studied over the years by numerous architects and scholars because of its superior preservation and the ability to see the years of evolution. These studies have led to many discoveries about other antebellum homes and plantations that would not be possible had a restoration been performed in 1974. Additionally, our methods of archaeology and study change and improve over time as we learn more. So, something that we see as important now, due to the knowledge we gained in excavations, may have seemed insignificant 50 years ago and would not have been saved or preserved. This is why digital restorations and the use of models is extremely important and is a better choice than to physically restore the site, because digital restorations are going to always be malleable. Once you physically change the site, that's pretty much it. You have physically changed it. This is especially applicable when the physical restoration of a site is done simply for tourism purposes and not for the gaining of knowledge.